And so unfortunately for us today, our original moderator, Gary Bass, actually had a family emergency. So I'll be filling in for him today as our moderator. And so just a few guidelines to keep in mind. First of all, please keep yourself muted during the call. And then we will begin with each panelist offering their own initial thoughts and insights on these issues. And from there, we will build on those thoughts with questions, further discussion, and then also audience questions. So any questions that you have, I would ask that you please direct them to me, Bailey Scott, or to the broader group chat, to everyone in the chat function. So please type those up and send them in, and we will try to incorporate them into the panel discussion. And with that, let me introduce you to our wonderful panelists for today. So first we have Elizabeth Ferris. Dr. Ferris is at the Institute for the Study of International Migration, which is at Georgetown, and she is a research professor there. And she's also a non-resident senior fellow in foreign policy at Brookings Institution. She's previously worked as a senior fellow and co-director at the Brookings Institution, and has worked in the field of international humanitarian response at a variety of nonprofits, such as the World Council of Churches, International Council of Voluntary Agencies, the Life and Peace Institute, and the Church World Service Immigration and Refugee Program. She has also served as a professor at several US universities and served as a Fulbright professor at the Universidad Autónoma de Mexico in Mexico City. Her published work mainly focuses on humanitarian and human rights issues, and her current research interests center on the politics of humanitarian action and other issues related to civil society and protecting displaced populations. Next, we have Kemal Kirisci. He is a non-resident senior fellow in the Center on the United States and Europe's Turkey program at Brookings, with an expertise in Turkish foreign policy and migration studies. From 2013 until 2020, he was a TUSIAD senior fellow at Brookings and director of the Turkey project. Before joining Brookings, Kirisci was a professor of international relations and held the Jean Monnet Chair in European Integration in the Department of Political Science and International Relations in Istanbul. His areas of research interest include EU-Turkish relations, US-Turkish relations, foreign policies and trade policies, European integration, immigration issues, ethnic conflicts, and refugee movements. Next, we have Barbara Buckings. Barbara Buckings is with us at Princeton University, so we get to call her our own. She is an associate research scholar and the director of the Project on Self-Determination and Emerging Issues at the Liechtenstein Institute on Self-Determination. She's also a lecturer in Public and International Affairs at the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs. Prior to coming to Princeton, she was a pre-doctoral fellow with the Political Theory Project at Brown University, a Justitia Amplificata and Castle Foundation postdoctoral fellow at the Goethe-Universität in Frankfurt, and a fellow with the Center on Global Justice and at the University of California, San Diego. Her research interests lie in global governance, migration, refugee, citizenship, and borders. And finally, on this esteemed panel, we have Professor Justin Gest. He's an assistant professor of public policy at George Mason University's Schar School of Policy and Government. His teaching and research interests include comparative politics, immigration policy, and minority political behavior, particularly Muslim political behavior in Western democracies. He's also paid particular attention to reactions to immigration from white working class groups and the roots of emerging right-wing groups. He has contributed research and commentary to a variety of academic journals, as well as renowned newspapers such as the Washington Post, Politico, the LA Times, the Guardian, and The Hill. Prior to GMU, Professor Gest was a postdoctoral fellow and lecturer at Harvard University's Department of Government. And so with all of that, I say a very warm welcome to you all. And I would just love to hear your initial thoughts and reactions to the topic today. And we will start with you, Elizabeth Ferris.
Great, thank you very much. And thanks for including the issue of refugees, pandemic, human security in your conference on security. I'm going to start by talking about European refugee policy, and particularly the way in which in recent years it has become very securitized. You know, refugees traditionally seen as a human rights, a humanitarian issue. Europe at the forefront of creating the international refugee system. Indeed, the whole international refugee regime was set up to meet the needs of post-war and then Cold War Europe. And so it's quite striking to see the way in which Europe has really seen this increasingly as a security issue in terms of preventing terrorism, a security issue in terms of European identity, which will be discussed a little later in the panel. An economic threat, not quite so much, certainly not as much as in the United States, where you see similar processes of securitization of refugee policy. This creates tension in Europe between European values, its commitment to rule of law. All European countries have developed pretty good procedures for determining whether or not somebody is a refugee and developing what are called complementary forms of protection for people who may not meet the actual definition of refugee in the convention, but who shouldn't be sent back because their lives could be in danger given a civil war, for example. So you see this focus on security and refugee policy now as a security issue. This is, you know, it comes out in different ways, primarily through deterrence, trying to prevent people from reaching Europe's borders to apply for asylum, at which time they would enter these somewhat formal processes where human rights issues dominate. But if you can prevent people from getting to the territory, then it kind of assuages some of Europe's concerns in this respect. This is not new. This really began after the end of the Cold War throughout the 1990s. It isn't just European countries that are doing this. Certainly you see this in the United States with refugee policies becoming securitized, and countries like Australia also trying to prevent people from reaching their borders to ask for asylum. In the early days, these deterrence measures took different forms. First, we had visa regimes where you had to have a visa to come to European countries from which an asylum claim might be valid. Sanctions against transportation companies, airlines, trains, etc. Outposting of immigration officials in different countries, again, trying to weed people out before they reach Europe's borders. Europe also had many bilateral agreements, still does, in which arrangements are made with countries of origin to prevent people from reaching European territory. Increasingly, too, Europe has turned to what we call externalization, and that is measures taken by states beyond their borders to obstruct or deter the arrival of foreign nationals who don't have permission to enter that country. So in the United States, we had interdiction of Haitians, for example. Now you see cooperation between the US and Mexico to prevent people from transiting through Mexico to ask for asylum in the US. And you see these arrangements being made in Europe as well. I'm going to briefly mention the case of Libya and what's happening in the Mediterranean. Kemal will talk about another way in which this externalization is occurring through the EU-Turkey deal. But in the Mediterranean, things started to heat up in 2011, where you had a civil war in Libya, the murder of Gaddafi, you had an uprising, really a collapse of state authority. At the time, there were about 2.5 million irregular migrants in Libya, and the Gaddafi regime had managed to prevent the onward movement, but with the collapse of that regime, large numbers of people began taking to the seas. And there have been various efforts to control, to prevent the arrival of asylum seekers by sea through the Mediterranean by the European Union and by individual countries, beginning with Italy with the Mare Nostrum project in 2004. Later, you see Frontex playing a major role in the Mediterranean and various initiatives and operations intended to stop smuggling, to prevent the arrival of irregular migrants who might ask for asylum. In 2017, you had an MOU between Libya and Italy, in which Italy would finance and train the Libyan Coast Guard, whose purpose really was to prevent the arrival of asylum seekers in Europe. And between 2017 and 2020, some 40,000 people were intercepted by the Libyan Coast Guard, returned to Libya, many of them in official detention centers, many more in so-called unofficial detention centers, which have been real scandals in terms of the human rights abuses going on in those. But these are ways in which the securitization of European policy has been played out. So I'll stop there, Bailey, and maybe come back in the discussion and tease out some of the nuances of this main thrust of European policy to really deter arrivals of asylum seekers and the contradictions that poses for European values and politics.
Excellent, thank you. Kemal?
Thank you for having me at this very interesting conference here. I'll pick it up from where Beth left. One manifestation, one very striking and generally recognized manifestation of this securitization issue was the EU-Turkey migration statement that was adopted in March 2016 on the heels of this massive displacement of primarily Syrian refugees from mostly Turkey through Greece onto Europe. In the words of two prominent scholars, Alexander Betts and Paul Collier, this set a panic in Europe in terms of the viability of EU and EU institutions as the Schengen regime began to shake on its feet and member states started to close doors. So it was against this background that a deal was reached with the Turkish government. And when you look at this deal, the details of the deals, you see how human security comes up towards the end of this 1.5 page long statement. The primary focus is stopping the flow of people, which the application implementation of the statement did succeed, as the 880 or almost 900,000 people came down to about 50,000-60,000 within 2 years. And then the second part of it had to address the Turkish state or government's priorities, which had absolutely nothing to do with the refugees, in the form of extracting a promise from the European side that visa liberalization would be extended to Turkish nationals. The Turkey's sagging accession process to EU membership would be revitalized, and the famous customs union would be modernized. It's only then that a commitment was made in the form of burden sharing that the European Union would provide the Turkish government with 2 tranches of 3 billion euros to support the many programs for the growing number of Syrian refugees, who are now around 3.7 million, making Turkey the country that hosts the largest number of refugees, when you also add another 330,000 or so non-Syrian refugees, as well as asylum seekers. There was also another element of the statement that meant to address human security, which was known as the one-to-one deal, to encourage that refugees and migrants do not resort to human smugglers, that there would be, for every single irregular migrant returned from Greece to Turkey, there would be one refugee that would be resettled in the European Union. However, what is often overlooked, as rightfully this deal over the years has been bitterly criticized, is the arrangement that emerged from the statement called as the Facility the facility instrument for refugees in Turkey, overseeing the disbursement of the 6 billion euros. They have all been assigned and are being dispersed. I would argue that this is what has contributed in a, obviously not in a very perfect manner, to human security as far as refugees in Turkey go. There's been some, from my humble point of view, excellent programs like the ESSN, which stands for Emergency Social Security Safety Net. More than 1.8 million refugees every month receive a small stipend. This has been accompanied by a similar program that provides funding for families that are prepared to send their children to school to receive education, as opposed to going into the labor market in terms of child labor. The program has supported many more projects to do with language learning, vocational training, as well as access to livelihood. What has come out of this arrangement, very briefly, time is limited, I appreciate it, is that in the words of an international law professor, and along the lines that Beth has mentioned, James Hathaway from Toronto University, the EU has successfully bought for itself an asylum space. There's a lot of criticism, but by and large, the non-refoulement and the protection of refugees have been implemented. There's been times when this has been violated. We can come back to it. And much more interestingly, Syrian refugees actually became integrated or settled in Turkey, so much so that when Erdogan finally put into effect his threat that he would open the borders for refugees and migrants to make their way to the European Union, very, very few Syrian refugees attempted to take up this particular offer. On the Turkish side, there was burden sharing, and I think this burden sharing is greatly appreciated at the level of civil society, NGOs, municipalities, as well as middle rank officialdom, although the leadership continues to be very critical of the European Union for not chipping enough compared to the amounts that the Turkish government is channeling into supporting these refugees. But there's also been many words or ink spent on how the deal provided Erdogan with leverage over the European Union's policies. I think there I feel there's a mixed record. He was never able to get his visa liberalization and the other issues I made references to. And last year, when he precipitated a crisis, a border crisis late in February, it was prevented. Of course, the image that emerged from the perspective of both sides was not very complementary. There was a humanitarian crisis, and human security was, of course, of no concern to both sides. But now there is a difficulty for the government in facing this reality that the refugees find themselves in a protracted situation, given the traditional durable solutions from the Geneva Convention of 1951 is not working. Resettlement, I don't want to go into the details of it, but the UNHCR calculates that there is a need for just under 500,000 resettlement places for Syrian refugees. And in 2019, this was achieved around 10. And last year, around 6,000 or 7,000. There's no local integration that is taking place in the citizenship of the world, very limited. And the Turkish public is more than 80% against the notion of citizenship. The return possibilities are extremely limited. If there's an interest, we can go into the details of it. The situation in Syria speaks for itself. So it's a protracted situation. And where do we go from here? I realize I've run out of time, and maybe we can address that in the second round or Q&A, and also look at whether the European Commission's proposal from last September for a new migration and asylum pact has anything to offer moving forward. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Now let's turn to Barbara Buckings.
Thank you so much. This is a wonderful panel. So I'd like to start by emphasizing that I think in the strict sense, the European refugee crisis is not and has never been a crisis for Europe. So we all know that in 2015, more than 1 million migrants made their way to Europe, and that certainly dwarfed totals for previous years. But we probably also know, the large numbers of inflows are in the past, so they declined precipitously in a couple of years prior to COVID, and they have continued their decline. So recent numbers by Frontex from a couple of weeks ago indicate that the number of illegal border crossings dropped by 40% in January, February of this year compared to a year ago. I'd say it was never a humanitarian crisis in Europe, even in the heyday, if you will, of the arrivals. I visited Adana, Turkey and Vienna at around that time, and the contrast, was remarkable, right? So in Europe, the numbers were never completely unmanageable. There were fears of spillover effects for the safety nets, but those fears didn't come to pass. It was very different, of course, for the 3+ million Syrians in Turkey, and I think Kemal Kirisci has talked about this, or alluded to some of these issues very insightfully. That doesn't mean that there was not a threat to human security of the refugees, but when it comes to Europe, it was not a crisis in or for Europe. The other way to think of it as a crisis, as a threat to security in a more traditional sense, right? There's a nexus between refugees on the one hand and terrorism and crime on the other, because the routes that are used by refugees are used for other purposes as well. And so many of Europe's engagements in the Sahel, for instance, are multi-purpose, and Elizabeth Ferris has spoken about this very well. I don't think that this amounts to the level of crisis either, because crisis suggests, and Rosenthal has sort of helpfully defined it as a serious threat to the basic structures or the fundamental values and norms of a social system. So I think the only crisis we see is a crisis of values, probably the worst one since the end of the Cold War. So if Russia's values can be summarized as Putinism, as Professor McFall said in his keynote this morning, what are Europe's values? And I'll focus on a couple that I think are important because we see tensions. First is there's a commitment to a certain multilateralism based on equality, fairness, and with a view to delivering prosperity and well-being. Human mobility within Schengen is another value. Human rights is a third rubric framework, and the fourth is democratic values. So procedural values such as responsiveness to the population, and also more broadly the principle of self-determination. And this is where we see tensions. So first, we've seen contradictions between the Dublin regulations principle of assigning responsibility to first countries of entry, on the one hand, and then the Schengen principle of open internal borders on the other. And there's been multiple attempts since 2015 to resolve these contradictions through burden sharing, responsibility sharing agreements, including the attempt to extract a solidarity contribution for any country that refuses to accept its quota. So in short, attempts to improve and make more coherent the common European asylum system. But I think that at the base of these political disagreements are what Rainer Baubach has maybe euphemistically called the incomplete prior harmonization of normative standards. So in other words, countries never quite agreed on values or their rank ordering to begin with, and some of those disagreements have come to the fore. So similarly, we've seen a tension now between a commitment to fair multilateralism or multilateralism of a certain kind and human rights on the one hand, and then procedural democratic values on the other. I think this is the most generous way to understand the pushback by countries such as Hungary, right? Instead of, if we don't want to see it as a cynical, ploy or an illiberal push. One way to understand it would be as an argument in favor of self-determination. So the referendum in Hungary in the very early days of the crisis in October 2016, the campaign for the no vote, no meaning we do not want the European Union to mandate the resettlement to Hungary. The campaign noted, we have a right to decide who we want to live with. And global multilateralism has run into the same sort of problem. So the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration, which was signed in 2018, led to significant protests, in particular European states, including by governments, mostly symbolic since it's a non-binding agreement, but with some real consequences, such as the fall of the coalition government in Belgium. And Christopher Wellman has written about this. So he has justified restrictions on migration by reference to a right to freedom of association. We see this tension also in the interceptions at sea and other measures to prevent the entry of individuals into the EU, measures that threaten the human security of refugees on the one hand, and on the other hand, Europeans have rewarded electorally political parties and government coalitions that have championed the outsourcing of this so-called problem to the periphery, to wit, the agreements with Turkey and Libya and so forth. And then I want to end, I've got a minute or two, I believe, a couple of quick thoughts about the COVID-19 pandemic. So one popular view is that this has been a blow to EU multilateralism. So the New York Times just today published an article that was quite scathing about the joint vaccine rollout, saying, it is undermining the EU's credibility, noting, that even Guy Verhofstadt has called it a fiasco. But I think instead, we've also seen a renewed push to make the argument for a certain kind of multilateralism and the way that it is to everyone's benefit. So a few days ago, the World Health Organization, Charles Michel, and 20 or so governments, many of whom are European, argued that the world needs a more integrated global health system, and refer to values of a certain kind in its defense. A second notable point, I think, with relation to the pandemic is that the lower refugee flows may not last. So I'd guard against complacency. So the lower refugee flows may not last when the pandemic ends, or when the pain, the economic pain associated with the pandemic compels more people to move. I should note against that Alan Gamlin, writing for IOM, has said that actually he thinks that some of those lower trends may be permanent. But it's something to keep in mind. And then finally, against complacency, I think the longer term projections, while highly uncertain at this point, should give us some pull. So there's a couple of things that are baked in, if you will. So demographic factors are one. There's a growing sub-Saharan African population of working age and with sufficient means to move. They are already alive and they are growing up. And at some point, if they don't have jobs, there will be a tremendous pressure to move, including to Europe. And then second, climate refugees. So the World Bank has reported on this quite nicely, that sort of larger refugee flows are expected, and that is also baked in, if you will. So I think that maybe Europe would do well to resolve some of these tensions in its values, or the rank ordering of its values before these types of new crises and threats to human security rear their head. And I'll end there. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you so much. And now we will hear from Professor Justin Gest.
Thanks so much, Bailey. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining. It's a pleasure to be with you all virtually. It's a really nice compliment and dovetail from Barbara's comments where I come from. I want to argue that there actually is a crisis going on in Europe. However, it's not a migration crisis. It's a crisis of governance. And unfortunately, the reality is that the structural circumstances that have produced the earlier crisis, I think, have really persisted and remain present today. If there were another influx of asylum seekers or refugees at Europe's borders to the same degree that we saw in 2015 or 2016, you would basically see a repeat. I think it would be arguably even worse. And the truth is that per Barbara's comments about the demographic realities and what the projections look like about Africa's demographic boom that's going to be taking place over the next half century, the growth of urban cities, European aging, migration is effectively an inevitability. And so the question is how it is going to be anticipated and managed. And Europe is unfortunately stuck in a very unfortunate cycle. And the cycle begins and ends with popular discontent with immigration and demographic change. And I want to focus my comments around this popular discontent and the reactions to demographic change, which in some ways also holds hands with the really distinguished panel that's going to follow this one later on in the afternoon. So you have a continent that is subject to demographic aging, and its main source of youth is coming from immigrants who, of course, are diversifying the various countries and states of Europe, not dramatically, but substantially. And the reaction, however, to any diversification of immigration has been pretty hyperbolic and generally intolerant across the continent, particularly in some of the more Central European and Eastern European countries. And the right for their part, not the far right, but the center right for their part, has indulged a degree of xenophobia and Islamophobia for the sake of winning elections for the last 2 decades, and whet the appetite for even bolder reactions from far right parties, which have become increasingly normalized in the past decade. Many have actually taken government, are participating in coalition governments in a variety of countries, and some are actually in power in the premiership. And the reason why I think that this national level tolerance is at the root of European problems is because it has prevented Brussels from developing a sensible approach and holistic approach to asylum seekers and refugee burden sharing across its states. This is now, and this is how the cycle starts, because this then creates havoc when war or natural disasters, like what we saw in 2015, 2016, drive these influxes northward. And of course, it doesn't take necessarily a war or a natural disaster, it's just that's when things become acute. And the risk of havoc can then be leveraged by actors, much like Turkey, to make demands that compromise European security in ways that 1 million or perhaps even 3 million refugees or asylees never could. In fact, I would say that the leverage that Turkey now has over the European Union represents a much greater and graver security threat than actually what any amount of refugees possibly could pose. What the Turkish are doing now is they've been antagonizing the Greeks over maritime rights. They've purchased Russian defense systems, air defense systems. They've been threatening to close a variety of air bases and rattle the US government. And basically all of this is permitted or at least tolerated by European supposed allies and NATO allies. And one of the reasons why is because the Turks are able to wield the threat of holding almost 4 million refugees in its territory that could otherwise be quote unquote released into Europe. And so if Europe could actually make its public opinion more resilient to the presence of foreigners, to demographic change, these threats, I think, could be neutralized. And I think that is a fundamental reality of European politics right now that is largely being ignored. And the truth is we're not even close to being there. So I'll just share some overarching results from some new polling research that I've been undertaking. What we find is that the far right, and particularly those on the far right of European politics, are amplifying and inflating in their perceptions, have inflated perceptions of demographic change. Inflated perceptions and this correlation between inflated perceptions and support for the far right is driving, I think, this populist shift to the far right that is making people less and less tolerant of demographic change and leading people to basically be against the kind of burden sharing and holistic approach that would be required to actually prepare Europe for managing these kinds of crises in the future. Furthermore, on the far right and on this sort of immigration and Eurosceptic side of European politics, we see greater illiberalism. We see less trust in institutions. We also see a certain degree of appeal of sort of anti-elitism in there as well. And so I think by shoring up these kinds of public opinion to actually become more resilient and more open-minded to demographic change, even if you maintain some nationalist sentiment, would actually do Europe a lot of good. But as I mentioned, we're not really there yet. What's disappointing, I think, is that NATO is largely ignoring the sort of what I think is the core of this problem, these politics and this crisis of governance. Recently, a few months ago, NATO released its 2030 report. It's sort of a prospectus on European security or transatlantic security. And the only mentions of migration relate to illegal migrants, as they call illegal migrants, the undocumented or the irregular, but also terrorism. And they ignore the actual core of all of this, which is, I think, Europe's inability to actually process and manage the crisis itself. So I think that if, and this isn't, like I mentioned, this sort of merger of this panel and the next panel, but I think that they are very, very much actually interlinked. And the more that we can actually control our reactions to demographic change, the better we actually hold and have some agency over our own future in Europe, rather than actually being subject to the threats and leverage of potential enemies.
Great, thank you. So much to go off of with this. So I'll start with a broad question that I think kind of captures a lot of what we've been hearing from all four of you. So within the Schengen area, terrorism, migration, and the refugee crisis, or just the influx of refugees, it's already sort of provoked significant pressure on social, economic, and political life. And in many ways, it has provoked a backlash among the far right in Europe, sort of this popular discontent that Justin was just talking about. This speaks in many ways to also what Barbara was talking about, which is sort of this crisis of values that we're facing. The pandemic seems to have amplified this reality. Throughout the world, the pandemic has disproportionately affected marginalized groups, in particular migrants and refugees, but it has also emboldened many sort of right-wing groups, many of whom sort of are opposing immigration and refugee integration. So how do we see these conflicting pressures playing out in Europe today? And should this, how do we see this reality shifting EU politics in the future? Do you think it will have repercussions going forward after this pandemic? Feel free to jump in.
Yeah, I might jump in and say that I think one of the impacts of the pandemic has been that refugees, asylum seekers, irregular migrants are seen as a threat to health security, not just to political or economic or even values, but all countries in the world impose restrictions on the entry of people as a result of this. And even though most European countries allowed asylum seekers some way to make their claims, there's a lot more concern with the health threat that's posed by influx of foreigners generally. I think for Europe, the lack of legal migration pathways is a big issue, one that wasn't addressed in the new pact, but that you might offer some alternatives to use of criminal elements, which further adds to public attitudes of distrust and fear, given the association of smugglers and traffickers with the movement of asylum seekers.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't think of these as conflicting pressures. I would think of them as compounding pressures. When you entered the pandemic, what you have is you're basically pushing from a public opinion perspective, you're pushing the buttons that are usually associated with nativist reactions to immigration. One is resource scarcity, and the other is disease spreading, is contagion. And neither is obviously going to be helpful for open-mindedness to increasing admissions or even humanitarian care of people who are vulnerable. And that's precisely what you saw. In fact, actually, in the polling research that I was just sort of passingly referencing, what we found is that we saw much greater open-mindedness to demographic change and immigration among people who said that they were less worried about the pandemic. We polled people and we asked about their levels of concern, levels of worry is what we asked. And those who were less worried were much more open to migration. I don't think that's a coincidence. I think that's definitely a correlation that's really true and valid. And so I think that you're going to continue to see this. And so it's a particularly bad time, I think, to be moving on these kinds of issues politically. And so it's going to make resolution to these matters even harder in the current environment.
I'd like to take a different perspective. I'm going to argue that the COVID pandemic has actually helped. If we go back to late February, when the Turkish president so-called unleashed or opened the borders and encouraged refugees to move to the border and precipitated the scenes that many of you must have seen in the media, what stopped it was the detection of the first COVID case in Turkey early in March. And as part and parcel of closing the borders, the government had to take the decision to support the refugees and migrants to go back to the towns from which they had been encouraged to move towards the Greek border. The crisis then precipitated the conflicts that Justin made references to over the Aegean and the Eastern Mediterranean. But something more complicated did also occur. Although Justin has chosen to spoke Turkey and Turks as one particular personality, embedded in one particular personality, there are different positions and opinions on this issue, especially amongst, as I pointed out, civil society, bureaucracy and agencies. And what FRIT has done has brought these people together and has enabled them to cooperate, and has helped to develop a recognition within the ranks of the government that the refugees are here to stay, and that failing to somehow address the question of integrating them is going to have a cost attached to it in terms of social cohesion, social peace, and aggravate the existing economic problems that Turkey is facing, primarily because of bad governance, but aggravated by the pandemic itself. And it's interesting to see the way in which the president of Turkey has had to make a U-turn on its foreign policy, which has now culminated in last week in the European Council adopting a statement which is signaling a message that it wants to cooperate with Turkey. But the problem there, and that's where I think I converge with Justin, is that the human security part of that statement is hidden away almost in a footnote. The part that addresses the issue that we're interested in, the presence of these refugees and the way in which they need to be better integrated and better supported and helped to become included in Turkish society. And we must not forget that the Turkish society, the society I'm referring to, is carrying an important burden of 4 million people in its rank, just as it sees its economy and its living standards deteriorating. Now, the statement that I'm referring to from last week does open ground for revisiting the statement from 2016. But what is going to be critical is how it gets filled in. And what I find disappointing is, unlike previous European Council statements, the statement is absolutely silent on human security in the sense that Justin has mentioned, human rights, democratic performance in Turkey, the rule of law. So the issue turns around and comes back to what Justin said at the very beginning: a governance crisis in Europe that is helping to aggravate the governance problem in Turkey. That's my perspective on this. Thanks.
And I wanted to say something else, and hopefully it's not a repetition of what my co-panelists have said, but thinking about your question, Bailey, I think there's one potential way in which it will divide the non-citizens between those who already are within one's borders and those who are not, right? So I think we've seen increased pressure electorally and sort of by public opinion to keep people out, right? Because they are a threat, right? This is the usual, the foreigner with the disease, right, threat. In this case, bolstered by public health agencies advocating for closure of border, et cetera. But on the other hand, there's been an attempt to fold in, right, those who are already present. For self-interested purposes, right? So, but in accordance with values, right? So the vaccine rollout within the EU formally has made it very clear that they want to also vaccinate all undocumented immigrants, right? So anyone who is within the borders will have access to vaccines. Now, I've anecdotally heard that there's no actual way in which this is being prepared, right? So, I talked to someone in Spain, and so they really, I mean, it goes very much by province, but the person I talked with, for their particular part of the country, there is no way to integrate these people, so they're going to go by they're going to go down the list of citizens and permanent residents in all the various categories of priority. And when everyone has received the vaccine, they will start trying to approach, the individuals who are vulnerable and who don't have papers. So there's no real way in which this has been integrated, I think, in a formal way, but the value is there, right? So the undocumented must have access to the vaccine, refugees must have access to vaccines. And so if there is going to be a shift, it might be this shift between considering individuals who are present on the territory as one of us, in a sense that they weren't before, while also stratifying the border to mean even more than it did before. Now it's also the way to keep out mortal threats of a different kind, in this case, health. I should say, though, that it's very difficult to think about anything in relation to the pandemic, since that, you know, we're in it rather than looking at it with the benefit of hindsight. But those are some thoughts.
An interesting corollary to all this is I co-chair the advisory board for the International Migrants Bill of Rights, and a sort of side project that they're pursuing right now is being pursued by my colleague Ian Kissel at Cornell University, and actually Beth Ferris is sort of very familiar with this project because she's overseen it from its inception. You know, they're looking at the effect of the pandemic on rights provisions for immigrants across a variety of countries. And very interestingly, and perhaps not surprisingly, the pandemic has not been helpful. States have begun to derogate in some cases on rights that they've committed to. In other cases, they've made exceptions. It's all backward movement. You're certainly not seeing any progress on migrants' rights under these circumstances, and Europe is no exception. There is some good news from a number of states like Spain and Italy, where you saw the extension of health access to immigrants, a large regularization in Italy that I'm sure Beth is aware of, in order to protect immigrants and grant them access to public health provisions in order to prevent the spread of disease. However, outside of the Schengen territory, you also saw the closure of borders, not just closure of borders to everyone, but including to asylum seekers, which is a total violation of rights, of humanitarian rights. And so the pandemic has basically justified a number of backpedaling and backtracking from a perspective of the treatment of immigrants that's very much connected to this subject.
Great, thank you so much. Another question that sort of is somewhat related, but sort of more specific on some of the Turkey-EU refugee deal. So we're now 5 years out from this deal. And as Kemal has pointed out, this deal had some sort of consequences for refugees and human security, and had a sort of somewhat transactional approach to handling asylum seekers. And similarly, in the fall of 2020, the EU put forward its new pact on migration and asylum. And many have criticized that the pact sort of privileges more state-centric nationalistic concerns over human rights and the rights of asylum seekers, essentially catering more towards sort of these rising populist sentiments. Ideally, what should the EU do going forward to address migration and asylum with an eye toward this sort of human security question?
If I may, I'll give it a crack. Without going into the details of the new pact, when the vice president responsible for migration launched it, he put the new pact in 3 floors. The first floor, the ground floor, was basically what he called partnership with third countries to prop up the kind of policies that is defined under externalization. And then tightening up internal rules and practices to make sure that the borders are more secure, that Fortress Europe is propped up. And then thirdly, and that's where resistance came from member countries from Eastern Europe, putting into place a fair and practicable sharing of the burden. What is missing in this building, 3-story building, is a foundation, and the foundation is the reality that most of the refugees are in developing world, and they find themselves in a protracted situation along the lines that Syrian refugees find themselves in Turkey, Jordan, and Lebanon. What is missing in the new pact is a recognition of this reality and how the European Union might be able to help address this reality, rather than adopting policies that are not that different from previous ones when it comes to the logic and the spirit of externalization. And what is also missing in the new pact is there's hardly any reference to the Global Compact on Refugees that has been endorsed by all members of the European Union, with the exception of Hungary. One would have expected that the European Commission would have injected some innovative ideas from the compact. I can understand that the Commission might well have wanted to introduce such ideas, but in their interaction with the membership, that may have been blocked. Very briefly, that's where I see prospects of moving at least the EU-Turkey statement from 2016. And what the Global Compact observes, amongst other observations, is that the refugees' self-reliance needs to be strengthened, but as I tried to hint earlier on, also the resilience of host communities. And one way in which this can be done, that's what I've been arguing breathlessly over the last two years, is to create jobs, because jobs are the best vehicles of integration, but sustainable and formal jobs, so that refugees can actually stand on their own feet and become less and less a burden on society, and hopefully accompanied with a proper communications strategy, become more acceptable to the public opinion in the countries, in particular case in Turkey, more acceptable. And the Global Compact has really practicable ideas there. And I would have thought that it would be attractive to the European Union, because it would also lessen the pressure on the European Union to come up with funds, with financial contributions, which the most recent European Council statement seems to hint at. But I see this notion of going beyond throwing money to the problem being recognized and adopted, and maybe left to able diplomats to try to work out the application of it. And what I see coming out from this is an improvement for the conditions and the protection of refugees, but also benefiting the European Union in the sense that the fear that there will be waves of refugees and migrants will be diminished, but also benefit the alleviating that burden I've been talking about in the Turkish case.
I would say one small possible. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, Barbara, just to add, the compact also advocates resettlement, and when you go to the new pact, there is talk about resettlement. But when you look at the record of the European Union, it's as bad as the record of Trump's resettlement programs. And Biden, soon after he took office, he came out quite strongly about reviving resettlement. And I realize a lot of people think that I'm very naive and too optimistic. But could there not be an opportunity, given the previous panel and the ambassador's talk on the transatlantic relations, would it be really naive to put on the agenda of transatlantic relations the notion that the US and the EU working for a robust resettlement program, not just for Syrians in Turkey, but in general? And here I seek Beth's help, could we not envisage something like the comprehensive plan of action that was adopted for the both people from Indochina in the aftermath of the end of the Vietnam War? Barbara, thanks for allowing me to inject that in here. Thank you.
No, I just wanted to say I agree with your comments. I just wanted to say I think there's a potential improvement in the pact. And that is what Beth Ferris has referred to. EU doesn't have a strong or any really policy for legal migration. And so potentially, I mean, we'll see whether it comes to be, but potentially the pact includes, right, so there's this mention of the importance of legal migration pathways, and they mentioned the talent partnerships, right, to match skills and labor needs. And that is an opening to a broader discussion, which I think will be an honest discussion about the labor needs for the EU, but also just the geographic location of the EU countries and the likelihood of facing longer term prospects and pressures of inward flows of migrants. And so that's, I think, what, that might provide an opening. So a discussion of what legal migration might look like, how it might be regulated, and how people might be, and maybe going to Justin's point, how people might be led to feel more at ease with the prospect of actually including legal migrants in a more regularized form. Yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you. So I have one last question from one of our audience members, and it's about sort of the continued use of border controls. And so she asks, should we expect Europe to continue to outsource border controls through bilateral or multilateral agreements? What other ideas do you find promising for handling future influxes of people seeking refuge?
Yeah, I think all signs are that will continue through these bilateral arrangements, somewhat transactional in nature, really trying to push the borders further out to prevent people from arriving and overtaxing the system. I think this probably will continue. There have been discussions, so far haven't been implemented, to set up some kind of offshore processing, to have a place where asylum seekers could go and could be managed in an orderly fashion. There's been resistance to that from a human rights perspective, also from some of the countries that have been identified as potential places to host those, but that will probably continue to be discussed. But I think we'll definitely see this externalization of border control.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Beth, and Beth knows best, honestly. But I think that the crux of the issue here is that asylum seeking has become a means of entry, or at least entry seeking, for people who are not actually qualified to be asylees. And this is a really big issue that is technical in nature, so it doesn't get a whole lot of press. But what you are seeing right now is the explosion in the number of people, and this is true at the southern border of the United States as well, who, what I term, this is not a technical term, but they are non-refugee forced migrants. These are people who are not leaving their home countries voluntarily. They leave because they must. There's either terrible violence, but they're not being persecuted. There is a natural disaster or climate change with desertification or terrible droughts or famines. Their families are under threat because of terrible poverty, and so they can't stay, they must go. And so they're effectively forced migrants, but they don't qualify for the international definition of being humanitarian. And so they will not qualify as an asylee when they reach these gates, whether they are externalized or not. And so the world has to figure out what they're going to do about this, because they are, as I said, not voluntary migrants. And I would love to actually hear what Beth has to say about this, because to me, this is a vexing problem, and the solution from my perspective has to do a lot more to do with increasing the availability of legal admissions into countries that relate to circular migration, temporary migration, seasonal migration, so that folks who need to come in for labor purposes can improve their life prospects, but not necessarily settle where they're going. But have some kind of circular flows between the North and South to relieve some of these demographic pressures and economic and social pressures that we're seeing, and the pressures that are leading to this forced migration elsewhere. But Beth, maybe you have more sophisticated thoughts.
I don't know if more, but I agree completely. I mean, the lack of legal migration pathways to deal with this category of people who aren't refugees, but there's no other way to escape. This seems to be used. It is going to become an increasingly monumental problem. As Barbara was talking about, the impact of climate change over the long haul. I mean, the youth bulge in Africa is of great concern. Migration researchers are pretty clear that with economic development, migration actually increases until it reaches a certain point. I mean, the poorest of the poor aren't the ones that migrate. And so, I think that there are a lot of reasons to encourage Europe and the global North generally to be prepared with different alternatives than using this overburdened asylum system to deal with potentially millions and millions of people.
Yeah, and from U.S. government perspective, for those of you who follow at all U.S. foreign policy or interested in it, our cooperation with European states on this matter is limited to precisely, I think I forgot who mentioned it earlier, but basically counterterrorism in the Sahel. It's not really involved in the sort of migration development nexus. It's nothing about sort of preventing migration flows by actually developing the countries of origin. And yet you would be doing quite a bit of good. And European countries are investing in those ways, and the Biden administration is starting to do so in Central American countries of origin as well. And yet, to me, this is the frontier of policymaking, of smart, forward-looking policymaking.
But in the meantime, let's not forget that there are real refugees and asylum seekers out there. And if you look at the UNHCR annual trends report, you'll see that reality out there. Right now, you see what's happening in Myanmar, with the regular Burmese, let alone the Rohingyas. You see what's happening in Ethiopia and in Tigray. You see what's happening in Yemen and other parts of the world. These are people who are seeking protection for their lives. And the reality is that 85% of these people are seeking protection in the developing world that does not have the resources to support them. So again, please, go to the Bible, the Global Compact on Refugees, and look up some of the policy ideas, one of which is extending trade facilitation to countries that are hosting large number of refugees, as long as they enable refugees to be formally employed and eventually become sustainable, and in that way also contribute to the development of their own countries, bring about economic growth through the trade path, so to say. And this has only been taken up in the case of the Jordan EU compact. It has faced problems, but it does constitute a reference point. And this is what I've been advocating for EU Turkey for some time. And today, the Greek think tank, Eliamet, just published a report of mine expanding on if should there be some interest in that particular idea.
Well, I hate to end it here because I feel like I'm learning so much from all four of you, but I am cognizant of the time and we are a few minutes over. I just want to give a big thank you to our four panelists today. This was a really interesting conversation. I feel like I learned so much. We'd be giving you a huge round of applause, but sadly, Zoom gives us, a bit of a limited capacity to do that. But I'm so grateful you all were able to join us today, and we will be reconvening for our final panel in about 15 minutes at 2:15 on the same Zoom link. So please feel free to join us. And thank you again to our four panelists. I've really learned so much today.